Isabella had always been a quiet presence within the convent. Her life was a rhythm of prayer, reflection, and the solemn duties she had taken on after her vows. The other nuns came and went, engaged in their daily tasks, but Isabella often felt as though she were living on the edge of the world. The convent, nestled deep in the countryside, was her sanctuary, a place where she could devote herself fully to her faith without distraction. It was everything she had ever wanted, or so she thought. When Celeste arrived, the air inside the convent shifted. It was subtle at first, the way the sunlight seemed to burn a little brighter in the garden, or how the silence felt heavier when the young woman walked through the halls. Isabella had heard the whispers about Celeste, how she was the daughter of the bishop, how she had been sent here for the summer as a form of punishment. Celeste was wild and headstrong, everything Isabella had avoided in her life. But even as she heard the stories, she found herself intrigued by this girl who had clearly never conformed to the life Isabella had chosen. The first meeting was in the garden, a place where Isabella often sought solace in the quiet beauty of nature. It was late afternoon, the sun still warm on her skin, and the air thick with the scent of flowers. She had been walking along the stone path, her mind lost in prayer, when she saw Celeste sitting on the low stone wall, her legs crossed, eyes staring out into the distance. She was striking, though it wasn't just her beauty that drew Isabella's gaze. It was the way Celeste seemed untamed, like she belonged to the world beyond the convent walls. Beautiful, isn't it? Celeste's voice broke the silence, soft but full of a quiet confidence. Isabella paused, uncertain of what to say. Yes, it is, Isabella answered, feeling her pulse quicken at the mere sound of Celeste's voice. Celeste turned her head, meeting Isabella's eyes with a knowing smile. I, smiling smile. I'll. I've been told you're one of the more devout here. One of the quiet ones. Isabella nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to such directness, nor to being observed so carefully. Celeste studied her for a moment, her lips curving into a sly grin. I suppose the quiet ones have their own secrets, so words hung in the air like a challenge, but Isabella didn't know how to accept or decline it. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't before, as though Celeste could see through the carefully constructed walls of her faith and discipline. Isabella began, but her voice faltered. She had never been one for small talk, especially not with someone like Celeste, whose presence seemed to pull at her in unexpected ways. Celeste stood and walked towards her, the soft rustle of her dress the only sound between them. As she passed, she brushed her fingers lightly against Isabella's arm, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. Isabella stepped back instinctively, but her gaze followed Celeste as she moved. I've never seen you here before, Isabella said, finding the words at last. No, Celeste replied, her voice low and almost teasing. I'm new here. My father thought it would be good for me to spend some time in the convent, away from distractions. Celeste laughed softly, the sound rich and full. You know the usual boys' parties, life outside these walls. Isabella didn't respond immediately, the weight of Celeste's words settling in her chest. Was she so different from the other girls who had come and gone from the convent, seeking solace or penance for their own reasons? Was Celeste here out of some misguided attempt to find herself, or was there something more beneath the surface? I don't think you're here for the same reasons as the others, Isabella said, before she could stop herself. Celeste stuckered, a flash of something unreadable crossing her face. For a moment, the air between them thickened, charged with a tension that made Isabella's heart beat faster. No, Celeste agreed softly, her gaze holding Isabella's for longer than seemed appropriate. I'm here because my father thinks I need to learn humility, but I think he's wrong. I think I need to learn freedom. The word hung between them like a delicate thread, and for a moment, Isabella felt as though her carefully structured world was being unraveled. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Freedom. What did it even mean? Could she ever have it? Could she break free from the life she had chosen, the life she had vowed to live? Celeste smiled, sensing the turmoil beneath Isabella's composed exterior. I know, she said, her tone gentle but knowing. You're thinking about all the things you're not supposed to want. The things they've told you are wrong. But there's something so appealing about the idea of doing something forbidden, isn't there? Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but the words failed her. She felt trapped by Celeste's gaze, caught in the pull of something she couldn't understand but that felt impossibly real. She had taken vows, devoted her life to God and to this place, but now, for the first time, she wondered if she had made the right choice. I should go, Isabella said quickly, turning away before she could be tempted further. The rustle of her habit against the stones seemed too loud in the quiet air, and she hurried away from Celeste's gaze. But even as she walked back to the safety of her room, she knew she had already crossed a line. Something had shifted between them, something unspoken but undeniable. The garden no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a place where the rules she had spent her life following were starting to blur, to crumble beneath her feet. Later that evening, Isabella found herself sitting alone in the small chapel, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. But her thoughts weren't on God or the quiet solace of the convent. They were on Celeste, her smile, her eyes, the way she had touched Isabella's arm so casually, but with such intent. Isabella tried to pray, to center herself, but the images of Celeste, so full of life and defiance, filled her mind, refusing to be chased away. As the light outside faded and the quiet of the night settled around the convent, Isabella knew that whatever had started in that garden was not something that would go away easily. Was not something that would go away easily. And for the first time in her life, she was uncertain of where it would lead. The days that followed were thick with tension, though no one spoke of it. Isabella returned to her usual routines, but every time she passed Celeste in the corridors or saw her in the garden, her heart would race, her thoughts spinning. The image of Celeste sitting on the stone wall, eyes gleaming with mischief, haunted her. Each encounter between them felt like a subtle dance, one that neither could ignore but neither could fully engage in either. At first, Isabella tried to suppress she felt, immersing herself deeper in the rituals and prayers that had always kept her grounded. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside her. Celeste's words echoed in her mind, taunting her. There's something so appealing about the idea of doing something forbidden, isn't there? It was the kind of thought Isabella had never entertained before. Her life had been structured, simple, a life of devotion and discipline, yet Celeste's presence, her defiance, made everything Isabella had worked for feel fragile. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though, that was undeniable. It was the challenge Celeste presented to Isabella's sense of self. The convent had been her refuge, the place where she could escape the world's chaos and find peace. Yet here was this young woman disrupting everything with her confidence, her free-spirited nature. Celeste didn't belong here, Isabella thought. She was too alive, too full of fire. And yeah, it was precisely that wildness that captivated her one evening. As Isabella sat in the chapel, trying to concentrate on her devotions, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. It was late, well past the hour of evening prayers, and most of the other nuns had already retired to their rooms. But there was Celeste standing in the doorway of the chapel, her gaze locked on Isabella. I thought I might find you here, Celeste said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the room. Isabella stiffened, unsure of how to respond. I come here to pray, she said, her words more rigid than she intended. Celeste smiled faintly, stepping further into the room. I'm not here to disturb your prayers. I just wanted to talk. Isabella didn't know how to feel. She had avoided Celeste after their last conversation, fearful of where her thoughts might lead. But something in Celeste's eyes, the way she seemed to understand without saying a word, made her hesitate. What is it you want to talk about? Isabella asked, her voice low. Celeste approached slowly, her movements deliberate, as though she was testing the space between them. I've been thinking about what you said, about why I'm sheer. Isabella's heart skipped. What do you mean? You said I wasn't sheer for the same reasons as the others. Celeste's gaze never wavered, her words a gentle challenge. But you're wrong. I'm here for one reason, to learn something about myself, and I think you're the one who can help me do that. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. I can't. I'm not the person you think I am. Oh, but you are, Celeste whispered, taking another step closer. I see it in your eyes. You're just as trapped as I am. We're both stuck in this place, pretending to be something we're not. The words hit too close to home. Isabella wanted to protest, to push Celeste away, but she couldn't. Celeste's presence, the way she spoke with such raw honesty, disarmed her. For the first time, Isabella felt as though someone understood the hidden parts of her, the parts she had locked away for so long. I'm not trapped, Isabella said, but even as she spoke the words, they felt hollow. I've chosen this life. Celeste's smile softened as though she could see through Isabella's defense. We choose things because we think they're what we should want. But I think you're scared, Isabella. You're scared of what might happen if you actually listen to your heart. For a moment, everything seemed to fall away. The walls of the chapel, the heavy weight of tradition, the vows she had taken, they all disappeared in that instant. All that remained was the pull between her and Celeste, the undeniable truth that something was changing, and it wasn't just in the convent, it was inside Isabella herself. I should go, Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. Celeste lingered for a moment, her eyes dark and knowing. Of course, but remember, you don't have to stay locked inside that box forever. Isabella watched as Celeste turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, Isabella saw the cracks in her own carefully constructed world. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a mold, to live up to expectations that were never truly hers. And yet here was Celeste living on her own terms, free of the constraints Isabella had always imposed on herself. That night, sleep was elusive. Isabella tossed and turned, her thoughts a whirlpool of doubt and longing. She tried to pray, to seek comfort in her faith, but all she could think of was Celeste, her eyes, her words, the way she had challenged everything Isabella had believed in. The next day, Isabella found herself walking through the garden again, seeking the quiet refuge it had once offered her. But Celeste was there, sitting on the stone wall once more, waiting for her. I was hoping I'd see you, Celeste said, her voice light, but her eyes sharp, as though she could read Isabella's every thought, unsure of what to do. I've been thinking, she said slowly, about what you said, about being trapped. I don't know if I'm ready to, Celeste interrupted her, standing up and stepping closer. You don't have to be ready, she said gently. You just have to listen to yourself. Not to what they tell you, not to what you've always believed. Just listen. Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The world around her seemed to fade as Celeste took her hand, the touch sending a shock through her that she couldn't explain. I'm not asking you to change everything, Isabella, Celeste continued, her voice soothing yet full of an unmistakable intensity. But I think it's time you stop pretending. For once, just let yourself feel for the first time, Isabella didn't pull away. She stood there, feeling the warmth of Celeste's touch, the weight of her words settling deep in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, Celeste was right. Maybe she had been pretending for too long. As they stood there, the world felt suspended, caught between the past and the unknown future. Isabella didn't know what the next step would be. She only knew that whatever came next, she couldn't go back to the way things had been. Something had changed something inside her, and she wasn't sure whether it was a blessing or a curse, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to feel the pull of something greater than duty or obligation. And she wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing: she couldn't deny it any longer. The days following their last conversation seemed to stretch on, laden with an uncomfortable tension neither of them could shake. Isabella woke each morning with the quiet ache of uncertainty gnawing at her. Every time she passed Celeste, her heart would skip a beat, a swirl of thoughts and emotions churning inside her. But she couldn't bring herself to confront it, couldn't bring herself to speak about what was building between them. Silence stretched, thick and unbearable, until one fateful evening. It was dusk when Isabella found herself standing by the courtyard, staring at the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. The evening breeze was cool, carrying with it the scent of earth and flowers, but it did little to ease the fire that had been burning in her chest for days. She had been avoiding Celeste, keeping her distance, but her mind always found its way back to her the way Celeste's gaze lingered, the weight of her touch, the sharpness of her words. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was a profound, unsettling feeling that was creeping its way into every corner of Isabella's mind. She turned to leave the courtyard, but a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You've been avoiding me," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't a question, more an observation, one that spoke volumes about her understanding of Isabella's inner conflict. Isabella stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. "I've been busy," she replied, her words betraying her as they hung in the air, hollow and defensive. Busy, Celeste's voice was amused, but there was something more beneath it, something that caught Isabella off guard. "You can't hide behind your duties forever." Isabella's eyes narrowed, a flare of frustration rising within her. "I'm not hiding." "Oh, but you are," Celeste countered, her tone soft but firm. "You've been hiding from yourself, from what you feel." "From what you feel." "You can't outrun this, Isabella." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken things. Isabella could feel the weight of Celeste's words pressing against her chest, threatening to burst open the carefully constructed wall she had spent years building around herself. But she wasn't ready to let it crumble, not yet. "I don't know what you want from me," Isabella said, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound composed. "This, whatever it is, it's wrong." Celeste stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, and for a moment it felt like the world around them ceased to exist. "What's wrong with it?" she asked softly, almost as if she were daring Isabella to admit it. "Is it wrong because it challenges everything you've been told?" "Everything you've believed about yourself?" Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts scattered and chaotic. "It's wrong because it can't happen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not what I was taught. It's not what they taught you," Celeste interrupted, her eyes locking onto Isabella's with a piercing intensity. "But it's what you feel. Deep down, you know it. You've always known it." The words stung. Isabella clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to deny it, wanted to push Celeste away and return to the safety of the life she had known, but deep down she couldn't. She couldn't sit the truth that had been buried inside her for so long, a truth she had refused to acknowledge. I can't be this person, Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. Celeste's expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. You don't have to be anyone but yourself. I don't know how, Isabella said, the weight of the words sinking in, heavy and suffocating. Celeste reached out, her hand brushing against Isabella's. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world faded away, leaving just the two of them standing in the dimming light. Celeste's touch was warm, and it felt like the spark of something long buried inside Isabella was finally beginning to awaken. You're not alone, Celeste said quietly, her voice like a promise. You don't have to figure it all out on your own. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet moments settle around them. She had always been alone in this, alone with her feelings, alone with her doubts. But now, with Celeste there, she felt something shifting, something she couldn't name but couldn't deny. I'm afraid, Isabella admitted, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. Afraid of what this means, afraid of what I might lose. Celeste didn't hesitate. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You don't have to carry this fear alone. There was a long pause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Isabella allowed herself to breathe, to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. That maybe with Celeste by her side, she could find the courage to walk a path she had been too afraid to take before. The next few days felt like an eternity, each moment heavy with the weight of what had been said and what was yet to come. Isabella's thoughts were a constant swirl of confusion, desire, and fear, and fear. She tried to focus on her duties, to immerse herself in the rituals and prayers that had always brought her peace, but they felt distant now. Her mind kept returning to Celeste, the way her presence had ignited something within her, something that had been buried deep beneath years of obligation and restraint. Despite her inner turmoil, she couldn't avoid Celeste. The young woman seemed to be everywhere, always just a step behind or a glance away, always watching, waiting. And every time their eyes met, there was that unspoken understanding, that connection that neither could ignore. Isabella tried to maintain her distance, but it was becoming harder. Celeste's words lingered in her mind, playing over and over. She wasn't the person she had once been. The life she had once known, the identity she had so carefully crafted, felt like a shell that no longer fit. One evening, after evening prayers had ended, Isabella found herself alone in the garden, her thoughts drifting. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows on the stone paths. She had been walking aimlessly, trying to quiet the storm inside her when she heard footsteps behind her. Isabella, Celeste's voice called softly. But there was an edge to it this time, a certain urgency that made Isabella pause. She turned, her heart quickening in her chest. What is it? She asked, though she already knew. Celeste stepped closer, her expression serious. No longer playful or teasing. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening, she said, her voice low. I can't pretend anymore. Isabella felt a rush of emotions, fear, longing, something else she couldn't name, but there was no turning back now. She was no longer pretending either. I know, she whispered. And in that moment, as the silence stretched between them, Isabella finally realized that what she had been fearing wasn't the consequence of her feelings, but the realization that they had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It was no longer just a secret. It was no longer just a secret. It was something real, and it was something they would have to face together. The days following their quiet conversation had a strange weight to them. Isabella found herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the soft murmur of the world around her too loud in the stillness. There was a shifting inside her, a quiet, constant pull towards Celeste, but it was more than desire now. It was fear, confusion, and something deeper, something she couldn't grasp. She kept telling herself that she was stronger than this, that she could distance herself from the pull she felt. But every time she saw Celeste's face, those same feelings were rekindled. The realization settled like a heavy stone in her chest. There was no way to undo what had already happened. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her heart, now tied to Celeste in ways she couldn't explain, throbbed with a quiet desperation. Celeste, too, was distant. Their encounters, once frequent, had become fewer. Celeste's presence was as intense as ever, but there was a difference now, a tension in the air whenever they spoke. Isabella felt it like a wall between them, built by her own hesitation, by the knowledge of how dangerous this all was. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear wasn't just of the consequences of their feelings, but of the truth they now had to confront. But as the days passed, a decision started to form in Isabella's mind, one she could no longer avoid it. She needed to know where this would go. She couldn't keep running. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the courtyard in gold, she found herself standing near the garden again, the familiar scent of jasmine surrounding her. She was waiting. The wait felt endless, like a slow, aching pull in her gut. And then there she was, Celeste, walking toward her, her face a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. Isabella's heart raced. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Celeste nodded, her eyes never leaving Isabella's. There was something in the way she looked at her now, something that made Isabella's throat tighten. "I know," she said simply, and the weight of those words hung in the air like a dark cloud. They walked together in silence for a few moments, each step pulling them deeper into a conversation neither of them was prepared to have. The quiet was heavy, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Finally, Celeste spoke. "I can't pretend anymore, Isabella. I've tried, but it's not something I can just bury." She paused, eyes searching Isabella's face for something in answer. "Perhaps I know you feel it too. I know what this is." Isabella swallowed hard, her breath shallow. The world felt dizzy, spinning beneath her feet. This was it. This was the moment of truth. "I do feel it," Isabella admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "But it's wrong, Celeste. I can't explain it, but everything in me says this isn't who I'm supposed to be. I'm not asking you to be anyone else," Celeste replied, her voice soft, but with a firmness that surprised Isabella. "I'm asking you to be real with yourself. You can't keep pretending that you don't want this, that you don't need this." The words hit like a slap, sharp and direct. Isabella recoiled slightly, but only because it was the truth. Celeste was right. This pull, this need, wasn't something she could keep ignoring. It wasn't something that could simply be wished away. "But everything is at stake," Isabella said, her voice trembling now. "Everything I've built, everything my family believes about me. This would destroy it all." Celeste stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "I don't care about your family's beliefs, and you shouldn't either. This is about you, about us, about what's real." She took Isabella's hand then, and for the first time in days, Isabella didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand linger in Celeste's, feeling the heat of her palm against hers, the connection too undeniable to ignore. Isabella closed her eyes, torn between the desire to stay in this moment and the overwhelming weight of what it meant. She could feel her resolve cracking, the walls she had spent so long building starting to crumble. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know who I am anymore." Celeste's grip tightened slightly, a comforting presence. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone. And you don't have to do this by yourself." Isabella opened her eyes then, meeting Celeste's gaze. There was a vulnerability there, something raw and real that struck deep within her. "What if I lose everything?" she asked softly. Celeste's response was steady, her voice low and unwavering. What if you gain everything? What if this is what you've been searching for all along? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. What if this was it? What if everything she feared was exactly what she needed? She didn't have answers, she didn't have a map to follow, but as she looked at Celeste, really looked at her, not as a fearsome force or a complication, but as someone who shared in the same pain, the same longing, Isabella realized that this was the only truth that mattered. She could let go of everything that had held her captive for so long. She could embrace this, embrace Celeste, and trust that maybe the world wasn't as unforgiving as she had believed. I don't know what will happen, Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. But I know that I can't keep living in fear. Not anymore. Celeste smiled softly, and in that smile, Isabella saw something she hadn't realized she was missing hope. Not for the world outside them, but for the world they could create together. Then we face it together, Celeste said, her voice like a promise. The decision had been made. And though the future was still uncertain, one thing was clear: Isabella was no longer running. The truth had already been set in motion, and no matter where it led, she was ready to face it, side by side with the one person who had shown her that it was possible to break free. The days that followed were consumed by a quiet but undeniable change. Isabella's heart raced with every thought of Celeste, every glance they exchanged. Yet, despite the intensity of what was unfolding between them, they had not truly addressed the one question that now hovered between them like a shadow. What would they do when the world found out? The secrecy weighed heavily on Isabella. Each stolen moment with Celeste felt like a fragile thread, barely holding together the fragile bubble of their growing connection. Her body responded instinctively to Celeste's presence, her touch, her voice, but every time she allowed herself to feel the depth of what was happening, fear crept in, stealing her breath. She would remind herself, as though it were a mantra, that they had to be careful, that the world outside their little bubble would not understand. But then, one morning, everything changed. It was an afternoon like any other when the storm finally broke. Isabella had been avoiding her family's constant probing about the time she spent away from them, but her brother, Thomas, had begun to grow suspicious. He'd always been protective of her, perhaps too much so, but lately his attention seemed sharper, more observant. And when he asked her flatly and without warning about her recent absence, the words rushed from her mouth before she could stop them. "I'm seeing someone," she said, her voice betraying a hesitation she couldn't hide. The look on Thomas's face shifted, instantly confusion first, followed by disbelief, and then anger. "Who?" he demanded. "Who is it, Isabella? You've been acting like you're hiding something." Isabella froze. The walls she'd so carefully built around herself seemed to collapse in an instant. She couldn't bring herself to say it, couldn't form the words to reveal the truth of what had been growing between her and Celeste. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no word. The pressure in her chest became unbearable, as though every breath was weighed down by the enormity of what she was trying to contain. Thomas's brow furrowed as he stared at her. "Isabella, I'm your brother. I'm trying to protect you." "What's going on?" She wanted to shout, to run, to do anything to escape the tightening grip of the conversation. But instead, she swallowed hard and, with a voice that trembled despite her resolve, whispered, "It's Celeste." The name hung in the air between them, and in that moment, Isabella knew there was no going back. Thomas stood frozen, his mouth agape as if he couldn't process the words. His expression hardened, and in the silence that followed, Isabella could hear her heartbeat hammering in her chest. "You're what?" Thomas's voice broke the silence. Harsh and disbelief broke the silence. Harsh and disbelieving. I'm seeing Celeste, Isabella repeated, each word heavier than the last. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas's face twisted with anger, confusion, and a palpable sense of betrayal. He wasn't just angry with her, he was angry with himself for not seeing it earlier, for not understanding what was going on. But Isabella didn't see any of that. She only saw her brother, the person she loved most in the world, standing there with a look of utter betrayal, and she felt a sharp pang of guilt. You don't get it, do you don't get it, do you? Thomas said, his voice rising. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't right, Isabella. It's not just dangerous for you, but for both of you. You have to stop this. Now Isabella's eyes stung with the weight of her own emotions guilt. Fear, frustration, and for the first time, she realized just how much her world had shifted. It wasn't just the truth she was hiding. It was the fear of how the truth would unravel everything, destroying everything she had once known. I can't just stop, Isabella whispered, barely recognizing the pain in her own voice. It's not that simple. I don't know how to explain it to you, but it's real. I feel it. You're throwing your life away, Thomas interrupted, his voice filled with frustration. You're throwing everything away for this, whatever this is. You're not thinking about the consequences. The words hit her like a slap. He was right. She wasn't thinking about the consequences. She hadn't allowed herself to. All that mattered was Celeste, the pulse she felt, the connection that had become something she could no longer ignore. But she hadn't been prepared for the consequences, hadn't thought about how it would rip through everything. I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas, Isabella said, her voice quiet. Her voice quiet. But I can't turn away from this. I don't know how to explain it. His anger was still there, but now there was something else, fear, confusion, and a terrible sadness. You're breaking mom and dad's hearts. Do you really think they'll ever understand this? Do you think they'll accept it? The words were a cruel truth. Isabella had never considered her parents' reaction. She had been so consumed by her own feelings that she hadn't thought of the pain this would cause them. I'm sorry, Isabella whispered, her throat tight. I'm sorry. Her brother turned away from her then, his back to her as he walked away, leaving her standing alone, the weight of her own guilt crushing her chest. She didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if she could, and as the reality of the situation truly hit her, she realized there was no turning back. The next day, everything changed. The whispers began at first subtle, just rumors among the few who had started to notice, but then the storm intensified. Celeste's name was spoken with disdain behind closed doors, and Isabella's world began to crumble. Everywhere she turned, there were eyes on her, watching, judging, condemning. The weight of the judgment was suffocating, but the hardest part was not the whispers or the stares, it was the silence. The cold distance that began to grow between her and the people she had loved all her life. They didn't know how to look at her anymore. They didn't know how to reconcile the girl they had known with the woman they were seeing now. And through it all, Celeste remained a constant, her presence a steadying force in the chaos that surrounded Isabella. But even Celeste could not protect her from the fallout. They both knew it. Their love, if that's what it could be called, had become a battle against the world they once belonged to. It wasn't just a fight for their love, it was a fight for their very self. As the days wore on, Isabella's resolve began to crumble. She wanted to run, to leave it all behind, but every time she thought about it, she thought of Celeste. She couldn't leave her. She couldn't give up on something that had become as vital to her as her own breath, but the world outside wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop judging, and every day Isabella felt the pressure mounting until there was no way to hide from it anymore. It was only a matter of time before the truth would break, and when it did, everything would change. The tension was unbearable now. Every passing day felt like the calm before a storm. Isabella could feel it, the inevitability of everything crashing down. All the secrets that had once been hidden now laid bare under the harsh light of scrutiny. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to everyone who had made their judgment, everyone who had already decided who she was and what she had done. The air was thick with anticipation, with whispers and sideways glances following her wherever she went. Following her wherever she went. Every conversation with her family had become an interrogation, every silence a silent condemnation. She felt suffocated by their disapproval, the heavy weight of their expectations bearing down on her with every breath. And yet, through all of it, Celeste remained a constant in her life. The woman she loved, perhaps the only person who truly understood her, who had never once judged her for the choices she had made. In a world that had turned its back on them, Celeste was the only refugee Isabella had left. But even that felt fragile. The world outside their little bubble was relentless, and sooner or later, something had to give. It was on a day like any other when it happened. The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally came to a head. Isabella had been avoiding her parents for days. She didn't know what to say to them anymore. The arguments were endless, each one making her feel more and more disconnected from the family she had once been so close to, but this time it was different. This time it was different. They were waiting for her. She walked into the living room, her heart already pounding in her chest, her palms sweaty as though she could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. Her parents were seated, her brothers standing near the door, all of them looking at her with a mix of confusion, anger, and something darker disappointment. Isabella, her father, began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." There was no going back. This was the moment she had been dreading, the one she had tried so hard to avoid. She could already feel the walls closing in around her. Her throat tightened, and her hands trembled as she sat down in the chair they had set for her. Her mother spoke next, her voice quieter, more controlled, but just as sharp. "You know, this isn't right. What you're doing, what you've done, isn't just a betrayal of us. It's a betrayal of yourself. Don't you see that?" Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to explain, to make them understand, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't just the disapproval of her parents that hurt, it was the fact that they couldn't see the person she had become. They saw only their version of her, the version that had been shaped by their expectations, their rules, their beliefs. "I love her," Isabella said quietly, her voice shaking. "I don't expect you to understand, but I love her, and I don't regret it." Her father's face twisted in disbelief. "You don't even know what love is, Isabella. What you're doing is wrong. This is not love. It's a sickness." The sting of his words was like a slap. She had been expecting it, but the hurt was still raw. She had never felt so isolated, so completely alienated from the people she had once trusted with everything. But as the words continued to fly accusations, demands, and pleas for her to reconsider, something inside Isabella shifted. She realized that no matter what she said, no matter how many times she tried to explain herself, they would never understand. They would never accept her for who she was, for the person she had become, and that realization, painful as it was, gave her a strange kind of clarity. "I can't keep living for you," Isabella said, her voice firm now, her chest swelling with a quiet defiance. "I've spent my whole life trying to make you proud, trying to meet your expectations. But I can't do it anymore. I can't be the person you want me to be. I'm me. And if you can't accept that, then I'll have to find a way to live without you." The silence that followed her words was suffocating. Her parents' faces were masks of shock and disbelief. Her brother, once so protective, stood motionless by the door, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and anger. But Isabella didn't feel afraid anymore. For the first time in months, she felt like she was standing on her own 2 feet. The weight of her family's disapproval no longer crushed her. the fear of losing them, though still there, no longer held her hostage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes finding her mother's gaze, then her father's before finally settling on Thomas. "But this is my life, and I can't hide from it anymore." With that, she stood up. The room seemed to spin around her, the tension in the air thick and almost suffocating, but she held her head high. She was leaving. Not just the room, but a version of herself that had been defined by the expectations of others. She was leaving behind the person she had once been, the daughter they had hoped she would become. As she stepped out the door, the world outside felt different. The air felt heavier, the silence louder, but there was something else too. A sense of freedom that she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out, heart racing. Celeste's name flashed on the screen. Without thinking, she answered, "I'm coming to you," Isabella said, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, I'm coming to you." She didn't wait for Celeste's response. She didn't need to. The truth was now undeniable. The storm had come, and there was no turning back. But it was her storm to face, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to face it. As she walked away from her family's house, Isabella knew she was leaving behind the life that had been forced upon her. What lay ahead was unknown, uncertain, and filled with the potential for more pain. But in that moment, she understood that she had made her choice. She had chosen herself. She had chosen love. And for the first time, she felt free.